let's see if I can try to make some sense out of this. I had this theory about why a circuit can become negative resistance, although it's more appropriate to call it negative current. But I have to change my theory basically because I understand it differently now. So, it's still the same image of a rod surrounded by a toroid, and the toroid is spinning and squeezing the vast expanse of space into the shape of a rod. So we have a lingam and we have a yoni, and the union of the two make the atom. Now the subatomic parts are the let's see if I got this right. The rod is EMF and the toroid is the MMF, but the MMF has two parts. It has a monopolar north, a north monopole and a south monopole, and they flow in opposite directions when we have normal current, and that includes AC current when the current and the voltage are in phase. But when the current and the voltage, because DC is nothing more than, think about it, when current comes out of the battery is discharging, but then we have to reverse direction of the current to recharge the battery, or we throw it away. But if we recharge the battery, we have to reverse current, and that becomes one cycle equivalent to one cycle of an AC current situation. So DC is really just half of AC. And that's why a perpetual motion holder can hold magnetism, because it's supposed to in between phases of the changing of the direction of an AC current. So, everything is really definable in terms of AC. Everything comes back to AC. The universe doesn't run on DC. DC is just a narrow view of the situation. Anyway, so in order to have a model, an atomic model that is based on electrodynamics rather than based on physics, we have to look at the model in terms of an AC situation. Okay, so we have two monopoles circulating, and I didn't come up with these north and south monopoles. Edward Leedskalnin did. So if they flow in opposite directions in a circuit, they are also rotating in opposite directions around the shaft of EMF at the atomic level. And this is current, which is AC in phase, or it's DC for that matter. Because at the second phase of DC, or the second half phase of DC, or the second half phase of AC, the little monopoles will reverse direction, but they'll still be going opposite to each other, and that's the significant part. Now, when they go in the same direction, when they rotate in the same direction at the atomic level, or when they and this is the misrepresentation of the electrons, in its orbit around the neutron. It's actually not the electron, it's the magnetomotive forces that are in orbit around the axle of the EMF. So when the two little monopoles, the north and the south, rotate in the same direction and they flow in the circuit in the same direction, now we have current and voltage at the level that we can measure out of phase by 180 degrees. And the interesting thing is, though, all we've done is flip the rotation plane of one of the monopoles. It's either the north or the south. Take a pick, I don't know. But it only has to be one. If it's both, then we end up still with them rotating or flowing in the opposite direction, but it can only be one. That means, see, I'm just taking logic here. That means logical deduction that one of the monopoles is tied to the polarity of the EMF of the circuit. if we look at it from the vantage point of the circuit, while the other one is tied to something else that is resolute, non-changing in its direction. It'll always flow in the same direction. And I think it has to do with source versus load. The idea that current flows from a high potential to a low potential. Well, when they flip, the other one doesn't care which polarity the voltage is. I mean, one of them does care, but the other one doesn't. So current is actually definable in terms of two definitions. One has to do with which side is positive voltage and which side is negative, and the other has to do with which side is greater absolute value and which side is lesser. In other words, which is the source and which is the load. Now we have to redefine what's the source and the load. It's not greater versus lesser, or else the switching of the polar switching of the charges of the voltage would change the direction of both magnetomonopolar forces, but it doesn't. So the real definition of source and load is not that one is greater and one is lesser, but that one is in charge. One is the cause and the other is the effect. See? So we don't say that the cause has greater voltage, because that's false reasoning, because in over unity circuit the source becomes greater than the load becomes greater than the source, right? That's the whole point of over unity. It's current flowing in the wrong direction according to convention. And when the load becomes greater than the source, that would redefine, but it's still not the source, right? Because if we turn off the frequency sine wave generator in my circuit plan, then the whole thing goes dead. That's the easiest way to shut it off. You just shut off the generator, but it's only putting out a microvolt of high frequency. So how can it be considered to be greater voltage? It can't be. Yet it's running the circuit, producing at the load end, or throughout the circuit actually, except at the generator. The generator is the only area of extremely low voltage. There is an area of the circuit that has no voltage, and then another area of the circuit on the other side of the motor transformer that is high voltage. So we have three different conditions in the circuit, and only one of which is the true source. So we don't call it a source anymore. We call it the master versus the slave. The load becomes the slave because, and that's the entire circuit outside the frequency generator, because it has to follow the consequences. It's the consequence. So we either call it the slave or we call it the effect, and we call the master the cause. But it's no longer source and load. Source and load is a lie. It gets everything mixed up and confused, and we don't understand, because then now negative resistant or negative current becomes an anomaly, and it's not an anomaly, it's the other side of nature. Now the other side of nature, and there is another side, is when the current and the voltage are 90 degrees out of phase. So in between 0 and in between 180, 90 degrees out of phase, and that's useless. And why is it? Because the magnetomonopole that was either traveling opposite or in the same direction as the other magnetomonopole now is at 90 degrees. And so the plane of rotation of the two magnetorotation planes of the atom are at 90 degrees to each other, and they're useless. It produces zero power. It's a zero power factor. Now, how can that be in the atom? Because if that was the case, that means the atom breaks apart, and we should have the ether. Or it doesn't break apart, but we're mimicking the ether without actually creating the ether. See, what we do is we create a condition, we manipulate electricity. Electricity is very easily manipulatable. And this is why physics lies to us, to prevent us from doing this, because this is not rocket science. This is just basic phase relation between what we measure as current and what we measure as voltage. You know, as a consequence, being a consequence of the plane of spin at the atomic level of the two magnetomonopoles, the north and the south monopoles, using Ed Leeds-Gallin's vernacular. So we still have the atom, but now the two planes of rotation are at 90 degrees. So where is the axle? The axle must have shifted. Or we have two axles instead of one. And each of those two axles are in the plane of the other rotating magnetoforce. So which is the case depends upon how many electromotive forces are there. Is there just one, or is there two? Because we have an atomic model made of a triad of three components. Yet let's look at the situation before we answer the question aimlessly. Let's have a reason for answering the question one way or the other. And I'm going to give you that reason. This is why I had to think this through. I had to turn on the video camera to take notes to myself, because I knew I had to think, because I was missing parts, and this was the missing part. Buckminster Fuller changed my world when I tried to read his book Synergy back in around 1980. I got it. It's huge. It's like a telephone book. And not to get off the topic, but his opening paragraph told me everything I had to know about him. That he feels that humanity has no blockage to its evolution. It's just endless. Growth is just endless. And that is a beautiful way to look at our future and our present condition, that we have nothing getting in our way of our growth and evolution towards greater and greater happiness. Exactly what Maharishi teaches. So, enough said. So I tried to understand his book, and it was very hard, but I got something out of it. He really pushes this idea that space is made up of 4 dimensions, not 3, and I already know that time is not a dimension, it's a force of nature that we cannot manipulate, because time is what consumes electricity. We cannot consume it, and it destroys electricity and is constantly recreating electricity from its constituent forces. So we cannot consume electricity. Time does, and we cannot consume time. Time consumes itself. So time is really in charge of space. And we would have to rise above time in order to understand and appreciate, to be able to actually and that's what we do when we manipulate the components of the phases of electricity in a circuit, the phases of current versus what we measure as voltage and what we measure as current. And I say that, I keep saying that conundrum because current and voltage are not the forces that make up electricity. You know, they're just what we measure. Okay, so they're the effects, they're not the cause. But when they become out of phase or in phase, you know, that shows that we have succeeded in manipulating electricity indirectly, because we have to do other things to make those phase relations change. We don't grab hold of the phases with our bare hands. It doesn't work that way. They're just the effect. They're not the cause anyway. So Buckminster Fuller proposed this idea that space is made of 4 spatial dimensions, and time is not one of those 4. All 4 of them are spatial. And it's very interesting because we take the cube is where our 3 dimensions come from, in which our classic Cartesian coordinate system, in which each dimension is passing through the center point, the junction, the intersection between the 2 diagonals of each face of the cube. We have 6 faces to the cube, and they come in 3 opposing pairs. Top and bottom is one pair, left and right is another pair, front and back is another pair. And the axle passing through, you know, and then if we draw diagonals from the corners of each face, where the diagonals meet in the center of each face is the junction where the axle of orientation or spin or dimension, whatever you want to call it, passes through the center of the face where the 2 diagonals meet. But what if we drew the diagonals not through the faces, but across the vertices, the opposing vertices of our cube? Now we don't have 3 axles, we have 4. Because if we take just one face and run an axle through, or dimension, through one vertex and its opposing vertex, we have 4 axles. And they cross in the center of the cube instead of crossing in the center of the face of each face of the cube. And I suspect that's how the Atlanteans transmuted the elements, by using an electrical machine similar to an electric furnace, an induction furnace. But they had the electromagnetic forces or electrostatic forces, or both, oriented along 4 dimensions and not 3 in order to split the atom of matter. They worked with shale because they had to dredge their subtropical streams all the time to keep the ports open, and so they had all this shale available. They didn't have toxic waste like we do. We should use toxic waste if we want to get rid of it and turn it into gold or whatever we want to turn it into, but they took shale out of their riverbeds and turned it into whatever they wanted to. And the most popular item was not gold, it was aluminum. They used aluminum for everything, because, you know, it's lightweight, this, that, and the other thing. But, and they can make vast quantities of it. Anywho, so we get the 4 dimensions, and they are oriented differently. Now, obviously, they're not the minimum of 3, right? You know, things at right angles to each other, but right angles to each other is kind of strange. So what if we have 4 elements at the atomic level, 4 forces at the atomic level, not 3? Because then, if the 2 electromotive forces or if the 2 electrodynamic forces of the electromotive and the magnetomotive both have polar opposites to each other, that makes 4 altogether. 4 spatial forces plus time altogether. We only have 2 spatial forces, but they come in pairs of polar opposites. And this is where we break down Eric Dollard's synthesis of electricity, or decomposition of electricity, beyond the framework of merely saying 3 forces into the nitty-gritty grits of how this thing operates at the atomic level, because we have to create an atomic model now of all of this. And so now, instead of just saying the dielectric and the magnetism, we say forces, and then we have to divide them into polar opposites, North Pole and South Pole. So the electromotive force is no different than the magnetomotive. It has to come in paired opposite of poles, a north and a south. But they're electromotive, not magnetomotive. And they don't rotate. They are vectors. They start from a point, and then they go off into the infinitude of space in only one direction. That's a vector. So one electromotive vector is the north, and the other is the south. Now when they come together and go in opposite directions in an atomic model in which the 2 planes of rotation of the 2 magnetomotive poles, the north and the south, are rotating in the same plane, then we have an atom shaped like a gyrating top, a top that spins on its axis. Except in the case of current, what we measure as to be current and what we measure to be voltage, being in phase, the top is spinning against itself. But when what we measure as current and what we measure as voltage are out of phase by 180 degrees, now the top is spinning the way a normal top that we spin on a table, you know, a dreidel or whatever, spins, or a gyroscope, in only one direction. Because we really have 2 gyroscopes spinning in the same direction, or 2 tops, because these are forces, not tops. See how interesting? A little irony here, a little interesting irony. But a top is a tabletop toy is more like DC, because we're only looking at it one half phase at a time to its full cycle. So see, it's no small wonder that DC current, or DC electricity I should say, was the first electricity that we invented, because it's the way we look at things. We look at things only one half of the situation. We don't consider cause versus effect. Charlie Rich used to say this all the time. We have to consider the effect of cause. What actions do we put into creation? What are going to be the consequences? And I never gave thought to the consequences. I just acted, like an adolescent, acts, without, or a pre-adolescent for that matter, and not thinking about the consequences. And I just, but it feels right, That may be true, but it may have dire consequences, because you don't live in a society that's as high-minded, idealistic as you are, is the fuller expression of my problems with society. I act idealistically. I don't act practically, or pragmatically is maybe the better word. Anyway, so if truth be told, that's why I'm writing books and putting a price on them, because I got my nose clipped so many times sharing in the public that because nobody wants to believe in free energy, nobody wants to believe that it exists. Well, we have the wrong atomic model because physics lies to us. Okay, so this is the new atomic model. So the electromotive forces come in poles, in monopoles, just like the magnetomotive. But they don't spin. They just shoot out in a straight line, because it's the electromotive force that binds the universe together. All the particles, all the atoms of the universe are connected to each other electrostatically, because this is the electrostatic line of force, in which the 2 points of an electrostatic line of force terminate on 2 objects, in this case 2 atoms at the atomic level, and 2 objects at the macroscopic level if we're looking at electrostatics at the macroscopic level. But everything, whatever macroscopic or microscopic, it still behaves fundamentally the same way. All of the stuff of the universe are tied together electrostatically. That means that everything is communicating, this is important, with everything else electrostatically. This is how the body communicates outside the neurons. This is how, according to Robert Otto Becker, Dr. MD, author of The Body Electric, had made the statement that the body doesn't use the neurons when it's regenerating a limb, such as a salamander, or if we induce it artificially, induce it in a human or an animal, such as a lab rat. 400 successful conducted experiments of fully being in control of the regeneration process of an amputated limb. You could turn it on and off at will. Well, the energy, he found out, does not go through the neurons. It goes, he postulated that it traveled along the myelin sheath of the neurons, which is the equivalent to a wire. It's the resistance of the neuron, the insulation of the neuron. And because myelin is made of fatty tissue, and it protects the neurons underneath from losing their voltage charge. But you could just as easily say the rest of the body, because the rest of the body offers resistance. Marty Zucker wrote that in the book, the Earthing book, that the whole body acts as this resistor. And Becker said the same statement, so they both concur that the body acts, except Becker put it more succinctly. He said the body is a semiconductor in which it takes time for a voltage change to move across the entire body, because the body is a voltage gradient, is what I say. It's a topographic map of a voltage gradient topographic map, in that every cell knows its position, its place, and thus, because of that voltage gradient, knows how to function. When a stem cell wants to become a cell, it knows why to become a nose cell, the tip of a nose cell, or a tip of a finger cell, or whatever, due to its position in the body, because every cell has its own voltage. It's an address that locates that cell in between its surrounding cells, because it has the voltage level that is in between those cells that surround it. So it's very easy for it to pick up voltage. Just pick one that's in between all the other cells that surrounds the position you're going to take up permanently somewhere within the tissue structure of the body. And that determines your function, is your voltage. And then you know which area of the DNA to read to find out how you are to behave. And of course what shape and function you're supposed to take up in your new role as a non-stem cell, as a body cell, a bone cell or a finger cell, a tissue, skin cell or whatever. Well, the universe is no different than the body. Just as it says in the Vedas, as is the body, so is the cosmos, the cosmic body. And it's all tied together by being a voltage gradient system of electrostatic connection. But that's electrostatics, or what Eric Dollard prefers to call the dielectric. But magnetism, or what we call current, which is, magnetism is the flip side of looking at current. Current is goes into orbit, is a force that goes into orbit around a point and never ends on a point. It ends on itself. And that causes rotation, the toroidal shape of rotation to occur, or the spinning plane. We really don't know what happens at the atomic level, right? I haven't seen it, but it's a spin of some kind. It's either toroidal or it's planar, like the plane of rotating matter surrounding this planet Saturn, which you could say is a toroid. It's just a flattened toroid, just like the Earth is a flattened globe, So whatever, however you take the argument. Let's just say a flattened toroid, depending on the spin rate. Because that's all a flat disk is a flattened toroid due to a high spin rate. So let's say it's a toroid for safekeeping, because a toroid is the magnetic shape of a permanent perpetual motion holder in which there's no north and south pole exiting a toroid, and so all the magnetism stays inside the toroid, and it spins around endlessly because it's not losing any force, so it conserves it. Forces are very highly conservative. They follow but it's only forces that the law of conservation of matter holds at the subatomic level of force, not at the atomic level of electricity, which is what comes out of the forces interacting. So the magnetoforces rotate around a line of the electromotive. So if we have four ingredients to the atom, four forces I should say, to the atom, but what is it when they are 90 degrees? The two magnetomotive poles are 90 degrees out of phase with each other, but still atomically glued together. They may not be 90 degrees to the electromotive force that they spin around anymore. They may be only 45. In order for, because by definition an electromotive force cannot be parallel to the plane of a rotation. But if it's not 90 degrees, the only other option is 45. And so that means that when we are measuring that current and voltage are out of phase by 90 degrees, what we're really measuring is that the EMF and its associated, the monopole EMF and the monopole magneto that's associated with that monopole EMF are 90 degrees to each other, because that's what we're measuring. I guess what it is telling us is that we have a habit of measuring only one side of the circuit. Let's say it's, DC or whatever. We're measuring only one half of the current, or one half of the voltage for that matter. Well, no, in the case of voltage, we simply arbitrarily pick one voltage monopole as our reference and call that ground, call it common, our common reference. But in the case of the current, we ignore one of the two currents. And it's funny though, because we already have the knowledge of the two currents flowing in opposite directions. We say there's the conventional direction, which is the direction that all our diodes point in, and then we have The one that we actually focus on is, we call it the direction of flow of the electrons, and that flows in the opposite direction. So we already have the two magnetoforces. We just look at one in terms of its direction, and we ignore the other, or whatever. It's funny. We have the knowledge. We just don't give credit where credit is due. And that's really the problem. We don't have the whole picture. Physics has confused us. So, getting back to what happens when things are 90 degrees out of phase at the level that we measure, it's only the electromotive and the magnetomotive of the corresponding monopoles that are matched up with each other that are 90 degrees out of phase. But in actuality, the two sets of electromotive and magneto, the two sets of north and south poles, are 45 degrees out of whack with each other, in order that no electromotive vector intersects the spin plane of either of the other two magneto monopoles. They have to stay out. Now let me see if I can visualize that, if that's true. Let's see, we got a plane. I'm going to have to draw this, but I have to visualize it first, I guess, so I can finish this video. Yeah, I think what happens, because one is precessed relative to the other by 90 degrees. It's not 45. It all depends how you look at it. Precession, of course. So now we have a precessing gyroscopic top. Well, I'll be damned. So it's not that we're measuring that they're 90 degrees out of phase in the way that we would like to think in like very limited tunnel vision, but in terms of what's really happening is they're precessed by 90 degrees. And that's exactly what happens in time when we look at it from an AC. So we have all the knowledge. We're just not, from the standpoint of physics, we're given false information, but from the standpoint of electrodynamics, we have all the information we need. It's just the physical part, the atomic part, that we're screwed up on. The physicists have gotten it all wrong in order to prevent us from being in charge of our electrodynamics. And they get all the grant money because they need it, because you need grant money to deal with nuclear fusion and nuclear fission, because it's very expensive. But when you deal with electrodynamics, it's cheap. Any garage mechanic can do it and come up with overunity in his garage, in his shop. It's not rocket science to come up with free energy. You don't need a government grant. I don't even have the money even to do things in a shop, let alone a government grant. I'm so poor, I have to ask and beg for money from my ex-girlfriend, and she's living on the street in her car, just so I can have food to eat. Sometimes not even at the end of each lunar pay period, at the end of each month, Social Security pay period. Good grief. So here we have everything that we have, the knowledge of electrodynamics. We have it to redefine and take charge of the physics, for Christ's sake, because the electrodynamic people should be in charge of physics, not the physicists. They can be in charge of nuclear physics, let them play with nuclear physics, but when it comes to the electricity side, we should be in charge of our own affairs, and we haven't been, and I have not been in charge of my own affairs up until now. And I've been struggling to come into becoming in charge of my own affairs, and it's dicey. It's walking a thin line, but I figured it out this morning. I have a danger I have to correct, and I'm going to correct it today, so I can continue to evolve in my effort to become financially independent of the family trust and all the insipid karma, the viperous karma that has literally made my life a toxic affair, which is why I'm not with my girlfriend. She couldn't handle the stress. I could, and she eventually had to leave her. But we didn't start it. We were just the beneficiaries of the tumultuous effect of bringing a child into this world. We were the cause. We were the cause, but we didn't get to have a nice family. Now we get to suffer separate from each other. Yet we unite in a sense to try to help each other. I paid her rent as long as I could, and now she pays for some of my food and water. and sometimes my bills. So we still try to help each other. We just don't live together because I couldn't live with somebody who can't handle stress. I mean, she's very susceptible to fear. And as a happy-go-lucky meditator since the age of 16, what do I got to be afraid about? Well, when she got done with me, I had everything to be afraid of, and so it's been a slow process of healing for me. Because in reality, we have nothing to fear. Fear is really a fiction, but unfortunately, it's a hazardous fiction which can destroy lives, and that's what it managed to do. It destroyed our relationship. And it's like a virus. It can infect other people. It can spread if you let it, and that's what I did. I let it by associating with her because I let it, I kept forgiving her and thinking maybe she'll change, when in fact I was the one who was changing. I was becoming more like her. She wasn't becoming more like me, which was my hope. She was, but it wasn't noticeable. Not until I left her, and then it became noticeable. Wow, she's a different person than when I met her. She has less of the fears. I have them instead. Some of them have been, she's relieved herself, and I have them in her place, and I've had to work through them. But solving the problem of how to eat has been the solution. I now get to eat fish and cheese and yogurt, and I've been a vegan for most of my life, since adolescence. And now I don't have to be sick from eating them anymore, because now I understand I'm a diabetic. And I was a diabetic at birth. And see, it's funny, because when I was in parenting class to try to get back my parenting status from children's court, one of my classmates was wrongfully had her son taken from her, and now he has depression and has to take medication for that depression, only because they were separated, for no other reason, because he's diabetic, and the doctor had him taken from her erroneously, because calling her a bad parent, because she didn't know, because he never told her, because the kid had never been diagnosed before. He was just 4 years old. He had never been diagnosed diabetic before that point in time. So what are they taking him from her for? You see how the system works in LA County? It's unbelievable. They take and ask, and they don't bother to ask questions afterwards. It's so formalistic, going through the motions, because most of the time the kid will stay where he was taken, because once it's taken, you don't have the leverage anymore. They have the system has the leverage. It's unbelievable. And I went around and interviewed a few of the people at random on my floor in children's court, waiting to go into the court, to see why are these people in the same boat as I am, and most of them are simply poor. They simply cannot fight back. I found only one person who was wealthy enough to hire her own attorney, or private, she paid for it. And another person was famous due to the fact, or might have had some wealth, I suppose, but may not have had too much, because he might have been paying a lot of alimony. But he was famous. He was an actor, and I won't say who, but he was a famous TV sitcom actor, and he was in children's court. What is he doing here? If he could hire his own attorney or whatever, but he couldn't. Anyway, maybe he did, but he was in children's court. What is he doing here? Well, but everybody else was poor, not famous, and I was infamous. And anywho, so getting back to the atomic model. So we have all the knowledge we need in the electrodynamic to redefine the atomic model of physics and take charge of the electrodynamic aspect of physics, and leave the nuclear stuff to the physicist. That's their department, and everything they've said is probably true, but only for nuclear physics, not for electrodynamics. This is the important distinction. So I'm not trying to say that physics has lied entirely, just to ourself, the electrodynamicist. Okay, so it's a partial lie of physics, but it's a complete lie of electrodynamics. All right, so now I've qualified myself. And out of stupidity, ignorance, or wanting to take over the universe, I don't know what the motivation. Maybe all of the above. Maybe that's all three motivations, and money, greed. Maybe all four motivations are at the heart of why physics lies to the electrodynamicist. I don't know. The point is, it's happening and it needs to be ended. It needs to be finished. We should be put an end to this awful situation, because it really is awful to be a slave to somebody else's theory when it doesn't even concur with your own facts, your own observation. You know, nuclear physicists, run by the rule of E equals mc squared, which is fine for nuclear physics, but has nothing to do with electrical energy. Except when you want to be like Joseph Newman or Nikola Tesla, and enlarge, but in Joseph Newman's case, he did it differently. He enlarged the size of the copper coil, okay? So mass mattered. And in Nikola Tesla's situation, it had to do the hull of the Electro U-boat running the special generator in which the core of his coils, the magnetizable iron core, was bolted, magnetically coupled to the hull of the Electro U-boat, giving it more mass for the magnetism to soak into that core. Now it can soak into the whole hull of the Electro U-boat. Then mass matters. But otherwise, it doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't, because it doesn't consume it, is what I mean to say. Mass does matter, but the mass is not consumed. Unless we let electricity blow up the matter, get out of hand, and create an overunity situation in which the iron melts and the copper explodes. But due to electromotive force, where the iron melts due to the magnetoforces heating it up. Right? Current off, resistance heats up and melts the iron. Then, of course, we don't have a hull of an Electro U-boat anymore. And we don't have electricity either, because the circuit has been destroyed. But we're not figuring in the mass of the iron or the mass of the copper in terms of the nuclear forces. We're not dealing with nuclear forces here. We're just dealing with electrodynamic forces. So, in essence, there's a whole other side to the atom in terms of forces. They're totally legitimate, what the physicist talks about, but has nothing to do with electricity. Ours is very simple. Theirs is complicated and requires, a doctoral degree in physics and government funding, yada yada. But in electrodynamics, you don't need an education. I don't have an education. I learned all this from, evoked out of my soul, simply getting on the simulator for several years now to draw all of this out of me. It's just four forces to electrodynamics. It's very simple. Four forces in space. Four spatial forces plus time makes a pyramid, right? 1/2 of an octagon. Anyway, so there you go. 1/2 of an octagon, that's right. The other half would be the reversal of time, and that gives us the foundation for our 3 dimensions of space, in which we mix time with space. So that's the only time becomes a dimension of space, is that it's a concept grid. It's not that time is in space. It's just a concept. When we say, oh, there are 4 dimensions, 3 of space and 1 of time, we're talking about a concept model. We're not talking about reality, because the reality of space is actually 4 dimensions, not 3. But they are arranged, the 4 vertices of a square, a 2-dimensional square. And then we add time, becomes the apex of that square, becomes a pyramid, but it's only one side because it's time going in one direction, one vector, and time going the opposite direction, the other vector, is the other pyramid, or the other half to an octahedron. And a full octahedron has only 1 dimension of time going through it. Only 1. And or 2 vectors of time going through it, and 4 vectors of space going through it. But that's where we erroneously get this Cartesian coordinate system, because sure, we can continue to use it. I don't have any argument against using the Cartesian coordinate system. It's just not the way we purport it to be. See, we get our Cartesian coordinate system misapplied due to the fact that our body is made that way. But I said the body is the universe, but our body only in a macroscopic sense, in which we are bipeds, you know. So being a biped, we have a head, we have a tail, we have a right arm, a left arm, and we have a tummy, and we have a tushy. And those three axes of orientation give us this erroneous sense that space is made up the same way. But it's not. Not at the atomic level, and not at the macroscopic electrodynamic level either. It's four forces that make up space, plus time, the fifth vector. So four vectorial forces make up space, and actually two vectorial directions make up time. Because every meditator knows when you dive within, time reverses itself. And this is what Charlie said. You reverse yourself on the wheel of karma, the wheel of the cycles of birth and death, in order to throw off the stress. And this implies, and this is the other part of this theory that I was trying to figure out, that the spinning or rotating magnetomonopoles are not circular, they're spirals. And they don't they're not a snake, you know, the head chasing the tail. In fact, what it really is that one end of the snake is tied to the EMF vector, and the other goes out into space endlessly, or tied to the ether, whatever you want to call it. But as a spiraling, rotating thingy, because when we look at current traveling down a wire, it is a spiral. So why would we want to think it's a rotating top? You know, see, so the rotating top is a poor vector. You know, Joseph Newman chose the gyroscopic top as his model for the atom, but it's a poor model because it doesn't take everything into account. So I don't know where the well, it's not that hard to answer. Where does that other end of that spiral, magnetomotive spiral, go to? It probably goes to another EMF vector. Because how do the motions of the celestial motions occur? One thing rotating around another thing to one degree or another, to one larger or smaller degree. You know, the surface of the planet of the Earth spins around its center. And then the Earth spins around the Sun, and then the Sun spins around the center of our Milky Way galaxy. So it may be no different at the atomic level, in which the two magnetoforces have, or each of the two magnetoforce monopoles have two centers that they rotate around, something greater than themselves and something lesser. So the relationship, the magnetoforce, is actually also linking to beginning points. They're also vectorial. Well, wow. But in a different sense, because they're rotational as opposed to linear. And they must be linking size, something greater with something lesser. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine, where it goes off into space, where it ends up. See, at first I thought it just terminates on the ether, and that would then supply an infinite source of energy to its spin. But that implies, in order to conserve force, that implies that when the magnetoforce comes into the center of the atom and then goes out the electromotive vector, that electromotive vector has to go off into the ether as well and dissipate itself somehow. How, I don't know. I guess when it ends up at the center of some other atom, it dissipates out. Right, it dissipates out that other magneto spiraling, which is anchored in the ether. So it works. I just didn't think it through. How about that? So it's the magnetomotive pole is anchored at one end at the axle of its atomic model, the EMF vector starting point, but the other end is tied to the ether. No, wait. No, that's not right. No, it is right. No, it would be. Right. Because the magnetoforces do not tie atoms together. They tie atoms to the ether. There you go. So the electrostatic force, or the dielectric, or the electromotive is what I prefer, ties all the atoms together in the universe, but the magnetomotive force, or what Eric Dollard calls magnetism, but we really have to call it a force, ties all of matter to the ether. And that's what gives all of matter an infinite supply of energy. It's just somehow the electromotive force has to dissipate that. Oh, it does. It does it at the other end, at the other. So we have two vectors flowing in opposite directions. One starts from the center of an atom, but is ultimately fed by the ether, and the other ends up at the center of some other atom and goes back out to the ether. So just as the two magnetoforces are rotating in opposite directions in the same plane, though when we measure current or measure voltage as being either 180 degrees out of phase or 0 degrees out of phase, the electromotive forces are also traveling in opposite directions, so to speak. They're not traveling, though. They don't travel. That's right. That's the difference. The electrostatic force, or the electromotive force, does not travel. It merely has an orientation of voltage gradient. But when it converts into the magnetomotive at the junction point at the center of an atom, it has to start moving. And it moves. So, it's really strange. What is this? I guess that's where physics, see, now that's where true physics lies. In the nucleus of the atom, the junction point between the electromotive and the magnetomotive, and that's the area of physics. So physics has to be quarantined. It has to have its boundaries shrunk so that it no longer tries to talk about the electrodynamic forces unless it does so in a correct manner. It has to be quarantined because it's should be ashamed of itself. It's gotten the electrodynamics all wrong all this time. But it does correctly define the dynamics of the junction between the electromotive and the magnetomotive in the nucleus of the atom. All the subatomic particles that physics talks about have to do with the nucleus of the atom at the junction point between the electromotive and the magnetomotive forces. So we leave it to them to tell us what goes on in the nucleus of the atom. But let's just leave it at that, okay? That's all they know. They don't have the electrodynamic side of physics down. They've got it all screwed up and are lying to us. All of us, you and me. So now that we've set the record straight, they just have to be quarantined, that's all. They've been misbehaving. They have to sit in the corner. And the corner is the nucleus of the atom. They have to stay there, because that's where they belong, and not go outside the nucleus. Unless, the atom should fission or something, or fuse or whatever, Then we let them state their case, but not electrodynamics. That's not their domain. They should not even talk about it because they've done a shoddy job, a very poor job of dealing with electrodynamics. Now, my prior video I didn't post, and for good reason, because I really didn't have the whole picture. Now I have the whole picture, so I'm going to post this because you should really know this. This is important stuff. All right, and lucky for you, in the other video I was coughing and hacking. This one my voice was clear because I didn't speak on the basis of the pressure of having food in my tummy. I was speaking on the basis of rest, waking up in the morning, and that's the right time to do a video. The window's open. I opened it in the middle of the night to get fresh air because I wasn't sleeping very well. I had a nightmare. So I opened the window and I went back to sleep, and I had good dreams because I had fresh air to breathe while I was sleeping. All good dreams and a good awakening. So here we go. A good awakening is our future of the enlightened age of the Aquarian dispensation, right?